You were standing in the hallway outside the dining room, holding a casserole dish still warm from the oven, when you hear your son-in-law's voice through the half-closed door, clear enough that there's no mistaking what he says. She's a financial burden at this point, Guinevere. 71 years old, still asking for help with her bills. And meanwhile, we're stretched thin trying to keep the business afloat. Something has to give. You stand frozen in that hallway, the casserole dish growing heavier in your hands with every second, because the business he's talking about, the one he says is stretching them thin, exists in its entirety because you quietly wired him $200,000 4 years ago and have never once mentioned it since. You don't walk into that dining room yet. You just stand there in the hallway of your daughter's house and you breathe. Your name is Rosalind Featherstone, and you have spent the better part of your 71 years being the kind of quietly capable woman that other people lean on without ever fully noticing they're leaning. Before this story goes any further, if quiet strength, family, and watching the truth finally catch up to the people who underestimate us is something you care about, this is exactly the kind of channel worth sticking around for. Go ahead and hit subscribe now, because Rosalind's story is only just beginning, and there's a lot more waiting for you after this one. All right, let's go back to where it all started. You married your husband, Cornelius, when you were 23 years old, and together you built a modest but steady life. He worked as a machinist at the same plant for 34 years, and you taught piano lessons out of your living room for almost as long, one student after another passing through your home over 4 decades, filling it with scales and small mistakes, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child's hands finally understand a difficult passage. You raised one daughter, Guinevere, in that house, a bright, sensitive child who grew into a bright, sensitive woman, the kind of person who feels everything deeply and forgives everyone easily, sometimes to her own detriment. You loved her fiercely. You still do. That's important to understand, because nothing that follows changes that fact, even when it complicates it. Cornelius passed 8 years ago, quietly in his sleep, after a long decline that gave you both time to say what needed saying, which you have always considered, in your quieter moments, a strange kind of mercy. He left you the house, fully paid off, a modest pension, and this is the part almost nobody in your family knew, a life insurance payout and a small but carefully managed investment portfolio that he had built, patiently over 3 decades, dollar by dollar, the way careful people do when they've watched too many others get caught unprepared. You never told Guinevere the full extent of what Cornelius left behind. Partly out of habit, you had never been someone who discussed money openly, even within family, and partly, if you're honest with yourself, out of an old instinct to protect your daughter from ever treating you differently because of what you had. You wanted to be her mother, not her inheritance. That instinct, you would later realize, protected you far more than it ever protected her. Guinevere married Cormac Ashworth 6 years ago. In a wedding you paid for almost entirely yourself, though you never once mentioned that either. Cormac was charismatic, in the particular way that makes people trust him faster than they probably should. Quick with a compliment, quicker with a plan, the kind of man who always had a new idea about to change everything, if only the timing would finally cooperate. You liked him well enough in the beginning. You wanted to like him for Guinevere's sake, and there was something genuinely endearing about his ambition, his restless energy, the way he talked about building something of his own instead of working for someone else for 30 years the way Cornelius had. 4 years ago, Cormac came to you privately, without Guinevere present, and asked to borrow money to start a specialty logistics company, a small operation, coordinating freight for regional manufacturers, an industry he knew well from years of working in warehouse management. He needed $200,000 for initial equipment, licensing, and operating capital. You remember sitting across from him at your kitchen table, the same table where you'd once taught countless piano students the difference between a whole note and a half note, listening to him describe his vision with genuine, contagious excitement. You remember thinking quietly of Cornelius and how much he would have respected a young man willing to take a real risk. Instead of waiting safely for permission, you gave Cormac the money. Not as a gift exactly. You drew up simple paperwork, a private loan agreement with modest interest, more for the sake of clarity than because you expected repayment to matter much to your own finances. You told him you didn't want Guinevere to know the specifics, Not because you were hiding anything shameful, but because you didn't want your daughter's marriage to carry the particular weight of owing her own mother something so significant. You wanted them to feel, as a young couple, like they were building their own life. That decision, made out of love, out of a desire to protect your daughter's pride in her marriage, would become the very thing Cormac used 4 years later to paint you as a burden instead of the reason his business existed at all. The business, Ashworth Regional Logistics, grew steadily over those 4 years, exactly the way Cormac had promised it would. By year 2, he had 3 trucks and a small warehouse lease. By year 3, he had expanded into a second regional contract that tripled his revenue. By year 4, he was talking at family dinners about expanding into a third state, about hiring a small executive team, about the kind of future that made Guinevere's eyes light up with genuine pride for her husband's accomplishments. You sat through those dinners smiling, genuinely happy for them, never once mentioning the $200,000 sitting quietly in the foundation of everything being celebrated. You told yourself this was generosity. You told yourself this was what love looked like. Giving without needing credit, without needing thanks, without needing anyone to fully understand the shape of what you'd made possible. But somewhere in that 4th year, something in Cormac's attitude toward you began to shift. The way ground shifts before you notice the crack running through it. He started making small comments at family gatherings. Gentle at first, almost jokes about how some people your age should be more careful with money, about how retirement planning was so important for people who didn't have other income sources to fall back on. You didn't understand at first that he was talking about you. You didn't understand that somewhere in his mind, the $200,000 had been quietly recategorized, not as an investment. He was still, technically, repaying in modest installments, but as a debt he resented, a leash he wanted cut, a reminder of a dependency he found increasingly humiliating for a man who now saw himself as a successful self-made entrepreneur. You began to notice, too, how he'd started speaking about you to Guinevere in ways that filtered back to you secondhand. Comments about how you always needed something, about how your modest monthly loan repayments, the ones he'd insisted on structuring himself, were somehow now framed as you draining the business rather than simply receiving back a fraction of what you'd given. It is a particular kind of quiet cruelty, being recast as a burden by the very success you funded. You felt it happening slowly, the way you feel a headache building before it fully arrives, present, undeniable, and somehow still easy to dismiss as nothing, right up until the moment it isn't. The night you overheard him in the hallway. You had come over for Sunday dinner exactly the way you had for years, carrying a casserole the way you always did, looking forward to seeing your grandchildren, Peregrine and Rena, who at 7 and 5 years old still ran to greet you at the door with the particular unguarded joy that only small children have left to give. You had arrived a few minutes early, letting yourself in through the side door the way Guinevere had always told you to, and you were walking toward the dining room when you heard Cormac's voice through the half-closed door, mid-conversation with your daughter. She's a financial burden at this point, Guinevere. 71 years old, still asking for help with her bills. And meanwhile, we're stretched thin trying to keep the business afloat. Something has to give. You stood frozen in that hallway, casserole dish warming your hands, listening to your daughter's voice respond, quieter, more hesitant than his. She's not asking for help, Cormac. When has she ever asked us for money? That's not the point, he said, an edge of irritation creeping in. The point is the optics. My investors are starting to ask questions about cash flow. And I can't have it look like we're supporting an elderly parent on top of everything else. We need to talk about finding her a smaller place, maybe assisted living, something that takes the pressure off. You felt something in your chest go very still and very cold. Standing there in that hallway, not the loud, dramatic anger you might have expected, something quieter, something that felt, in that moment, disturbingly close to grief. You almost turned around and left that night without saying a word. You want that understood honestly, because it's the part of the story that isn't triumphant, the part that sits closer to the truth of what it actually feels like to be 71 years old and quietly informed by the family you built that you have become inconvenient. Standing in that hallway, you felt the specific, exhausted doubt that comes with aging in a world that increasingly treats older people as problems to be managed rather than people to be honored. You thought maybe he's right. Maybe I have become a burden without fully realizing it. Maybe 71 is simply the age where you stop being someone people build a life around and start being someone people quietly plan around. The way you'd plan around a leaking roof or an aging car that might need replacing soon. You thought about Cornelius, gone 8 years now, and felt a fresh wave of grief for the specific kind of loneliness that comes with growing older without a partner beside you to remind you, on nights like this one, that you still matter as much as you always did. You thought about all the women your age quietly enduring some version of this exact moment, mothers and grandmothers gently, practically eased out of the center of their own families, told in careful, reasonable-sounding language that it would simply be better for everyone if they took up less space. For one long, honest moment, standing in that hallway with a warm casserole dish trembling slightly in your hands, you almost believed him. And then you thought of the paperwork sitting in your safe, deposit box at the bank downtown, and the private loan agreement, signed 4 years earlier, drawn up not out of suspicion, but out of the careful, deliberate habits Cornelius had taught you over 3 decades of watching him manage money with quiet precision. You had never once needed that paperwork before. You had never wanted to need it. You understood, standing in that hallway, that you needed it now. You walked into the dining room a few minutes later, casserole dish in hand, your expression composed in the particular way you had spent 7 decades learning to compose it. Guinevere looked up, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. She knew. You realized that you might have heard something, even if she didn't know exactly how much. "Mom," she said, standing quickly. "I didn't hear you come in. I let myself in through the side door. The way I always do," you said, setting the casserole down gently on the table, your voice even. "I heard some of what you two were discussing. I think it's probably time we talked about it directly, rather than around each other." Cormac's face shifted, surprise first, then something more careful, more calculating. The look of a man quickly recalculating how much you'd actually heard. "Rosalind, I didn't mean," he started. "You called me a financial burden," you said quietly, not with anger, but with a steadiness that seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "I'd like to understand what you meant by that, Cormac, specifically." He hesitated, glancing at Guinevere, then back at you. "I just meant the monthly transfers, the support we provide. It adds up, especially with the business the way it is right now." "The monthly transfers," you repeated slowly, "that I send you every month." "As loan repayments." The room went very quiet. Guinevere's face changed first, a slow, dawning confusion, the particular expression of someone realizing a piece of information has been quietly missing from a story she thought she understood completely. "What loan repayments?" she asked. You looked at your daughter, and for a moment, the weight of the choice you'd made 4 years earlier, the choice to protect her pride, to protect her marriage, to give quietly instead of visibly, settled fully onto your shoulders, heavier than you expected. 4 years ago, you said. Cormac came to me and asked for $200,000 to start. Ashworth Regional Logistics. I gave it to him as a private loan, with modest interest, structured so that you two wouldn't feel burdened by owing your own mother something so significant. The monthly transfers Cormac is referring to are his repayments to me, not the other way around. Guinevere turned to look at her husband, and you watched something complicated move across her face. Not immediate anger, but a slow, careful reassembly of 4 years of family dinners. 4 years of comments about your finances. 4 years of a story that had been quietly, deliberately inverted. "Is that true?" she asked him, her voice quieter now, more dangerous in its quietness than shouting would have been. Cormac's face had gone pale. "Guinevere, it's more complicated than that. The business needed the capital, and I didn't want it to feel like..." "You've been telling people my mother is a financial burden," Guinevere said, her voice rising now, "while she's the reason your entire business exists? Here is what surprised you most, sitting at that dinner table watching the truth finally settle into the room. You didn't feel triumphant. You had imagined, in quieter moments over the past several weeks, that a moment like this might feel like vindication, might feel like winning. It didn't. It felt mostly like grief. Grief for the 4 years you had spent quietly protecting a story that was never protecting you back. Grief for how easily a man's insecurity had rewritten your generosity into something shameful. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," you said, and you meant it. Your voice steadied despite the ache sitting underneath it. I gave that money because I believed in you, Cormac. And because I loved my daughter enough to want her marriage to feel equal, not burdened by owing me something. But I need you to understand the version of events you've apparently been telling yourself and telling others is not what actually happened. I have never once, in 4 years, asked you for anything beyond what we agreed to in writing. Cormac sat in silence, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something raw, not quite remorse yet, but the visible beginning of a man realizing the story he'd built to protect. His own pride had just collapsed in front of the one person who could dismantle it completely. I think, you continued, we need to discuss what happens next. Not out of spite, but because a business built partly on my investment, run by a man telling people I'm a burden rather than a partner in its success, is not an arrangement I'm comfortable continuing quietly. The weeks that followed were not simple, because family rarely allows for simple resolutions, even when the truth has been laid bare on a dinner table. Guinevere needed time to process not just what Cormac had said about you, but what it revealed about the quiet resentments he had apparently been carrying, unspoken, for months, maybe longer. She moved with the children into a rental apartment for 6 weeks while she and Cormac attended counseling, working through not just this specific betrayal but the deeper pattern it exposed. A husband who had let pride quietly curdle into something that made him comfortable, diminishing the people who had helped him most. You did not forgive Cormac quickly, and you didn't feel obligated to, but you also didn't seek to punish him beyond what was fair. You had Thaddeus Renfield, a longtime family friend and accountant who had helped Cornelius manage finances for decades, formally restructure the loan agreement, clearer terms, transparent to Guinevere this time, with a fixed repayment schedule that Cormac could no longer quietly resent or misrepresent to others. Cormac, to his credit, eventually did something you hadn't fully expected. He came to your house alone one evening, sat across from you at the same kitchen table where you'd once agreed to fund his entire future, and apologized, and not performatively, but with the particular rawness of a man forced to see himself clearly for the first time in a long while. I think I resented needing you, he said quietly. It made me feel small, and instead of dealing with that honestly, I made you small instead. That wasn't fair. I don't think I fully understood how unfair it was until I watched Guinevere's face when she realized what I'd been saying. You accepted the apology, though you told him plainly that trust, once damaged, rebuilds slowly, and that you would be watching closely how he treated you going forward, not just believing whatever he said in the moment. Guinevere and Cormac eventually reconciled, though the marriage that emerged from those difficult weeks was different. More honest, you'd like to think, than the one built partly on comfortable silences and quiet resentments. Cormac began including you deliberately in family gatherings, not out of obligation, but with a visible effort to correct the narrative he had once carelessly told. You still babysit Peregrine and Rena most Sundays, and you still bring a casserole. Though these days Guinevere always makes a point of telling the children, in front of everyone, exactly how much Grandma Rosalind helped make their father's company possible, not to embarrass Cormac, but because she believes now that the truth deserves to live openly in the family instead of quietly in a safe deposit box downtown. You think some evenings, sitting in your quiet house with Cornelius's old chair still by the window, about all the people watching this story who have felt, at some point, dismissed by the very family they built and sacrificed. 4. Parents recast as burdens. Instead of foundations, grandparents quietly ease toward the margins of the households they once anchored. You want to tell them what it took you 71 years in one overheard hallway. Conversation to fully understand. Generosity given quietly does not deserve to be repaid with diminishment. Love that asks for no credit is not the same as love that deserves no acknowledgement. And growing older does not mean becoming smaller, no matter how convenient it might be for someone else's pride to believe otherwise. You sit by the window some evenings, watching the streetlights flicker on outside, thinking of Cornelius, of the careful, patient way he taught you to manage what you had, of how proud you feel, watching your family finally, quietly, insist on seeing you clearly. You were never a burden. You were simply the foundation everyone forgot to thank. They called me a burden. They just forgot whose money was holding everything up.